Ще раз, якщо ви не бажаєте бути на екрані, будь ласка,
Okay, once again, if you don't want your face to be seen on the screen, please switch off your camera. And now we start the recording.
Шановні колеги, дорогі друзі,
Dear colleagues, dear friends, hello. Welcome to our seminar. I'm really pleased to see all the faces of all the people who have joined.
Від імені колег, які тут знаходяться, від американських колег і від себе особисто хочу просто висловити співчуття усім нашим дніпрянам. І я не знаю, де зараз пан Андрій Посунько, але він у нас із Дніпра, тому ми зараз найтепліші слова до нього звертаємо. Мені здається, його і немає. Пан Андрій не долучився, на превеликий жаль, до нас. Не забуваємо, що у нас є академічний фронт. Попри наші Збройні сили, ми також воюємо. Це дуже потужна боротьба повинна бути, тому що боротьба із російською пропагандою, яка проросла в академії, це дуже важливо. І я вважаю, що ми повинні докласти усіх зусиль. Отже, ще раз вітаю, шановні колеги. Хочу привітати також Тетяну Гранчак, яка долучилася до нашої програми. Пані Тетяно, вітаємо.
Дякую.
Вітаємо, пані Тетяно. І ще раз, мене звуть Світлана Мельник, і я викладачка на кафедрі слов'янських і східноєвропейських мов і культур в університеті Індіани. І буду вести сьогоднішню нашу зустріч. Отже, дозвольте представити першу доповідачку. Це пані Лариса Якимова. Пані Лариса – доктор економічних наук, професор кафедри...
Larysa is a doctor of economic science, a professor at the economic department, as economic mathematical simulation department of Chernyvtsina National University, named after Yuri Fedkovich. Before Donbas occupation, Ms. Larysa was a lecturer at the Donbas State Technical University. And her scientific interest covers the mathematical simulation and promotional technologies in economy. And her today presentation is dedicated to the mapping corruption risk and humanitarian risk during the war based on data from Ukraine. Ms. Larysa, please open your slide. And meanwhile, I would like to remind all our colleagues that we have a simultaneous translation today. So please try to talk a little bit slower so our interpreters can manage the translation. Please, Ms. Larysa. Thank you. So let me start. So the topic of my presentation, sorry, I will now switch it off. It's the first part of my research, mapping the corruption risks in humanitarian aid during the war based on the data from Ukraine. Let me note that the international regulation, the international response to the full-scale invasion of Russian Federation was immediate. On the same date, on February 21st, 2022, the United Nations allocated $20 million from the Central Emergency Response Fund to fund the humanitarian efforts in this emergency. Over 10 balances of full-scale wars, total funding, which is coordinated by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, has exceeded almost $3 billion. The humanitarian aid was received by 11.5 million individuals. Over 4 million individuals received support from the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights in form of temporary residence, protection, and essential goods and monetary benefits. Almost 6 million temporary displaced persons are currently registered in Ukraine. around 8 million refugees in Ukraine are registered in Europe, and almost 5 million refugees from Ukraine applied for temporary protections in Europe. However, 17.7 million people still urgently require humanitarian aid. Such unprecedented humanitarian aid flow and the quantity of the persons requiring such aid raise a lot of issues regarding the transparency in the humanitarian aid. One of the key questions is how to regulate delivery of the humanitarian aid to its end recipients, but while preventing its loss in inappropriate use. In Ukraine, legal, organizational, and social basis for provision, distribution of humanitarian aid and control over the proper use of humanitarian aid, as well as requirements about publicity and transparency of this process are determined by the law of Ukraine on humanitarian aid, which was adopted back in 1995. According to this law, the key subjects when in the Ministry of the Social Policy of Ukraine and the regional state administrations, as well as Kyiv state administration.
Я перепрошую, можете говорити трішки повільніше, щоб перекладачам було легше працювати? Дякую, вибачте.
Ага, добре, добре. Як центральний орган виконавчої
So,
влади?
as being the central executive body, the Ministry of Social Policy and State Regional Administration, as well as Kyiv State Administration, are considered as a specially authorized governmental authority with special powers on humanitarian aid matters. They supervise receipt, storage, warehousing, and distribution and appropriate use of the humanitarian aid, preparation of the statistical reports, as well as accounting of the humanitarian aid. So we see that the law defines two key subjects. The legal form, the legal model of humanitarian aid supervision and accounting has proven itself well during limited military conflict in the eastern part of Ukraine, when, as we see, there were small flows of humanitarian aid, relatively small flows, due to the limited nature of the hostilities, and the number of humanitarian aid recipients was also limited. However, in 2022, so 2022 indicates that the rapid increase in the humanitarian aid needs and flows, which are now urgent, both in the regions where there are active hostilities and in the regions who are massively receiving the internally displaced persons. Currently, the number of partners at the UN High Commissioner for Refugees is over 707 organizations. This includes both national non-governmental organizations and Ukrainian national and foreign organizations, as well as various governmental entities and other stakeholders. As we see, these organizations cover the entire territory of Ukraine to the varying extent. For example, let's take a look at Chernovetska region, it's 130 plus. It means that we have over 130 partner organizations of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. The structure of the operational presence indicates that provided by the UK experts indicates that many Ukrainian NGOs, volunteer groups, UN agencies, International Red Cross, etc., ask our leadership how we can regulate the procedure for provision of humanitarian aid and ensure reasonable balance between the prompt decision making by the state authorities in the best interests of the recipients and potential and possible forms of the state supervision and control. Therefore, a number of legislative enactments was implemented in order to uh, in order to amend the existing humanitarian aid law. So now the recipients, the humanitarian aid recipients now don't have to register it in the unified register of the humanitarian aid recipients. The categories of goods which are considered the humanitarian aids are now extended. The simplified procedure for customs clearance of the humanitarian aids free of customs duties is implemented, and multi-level control is replaced with simplified reporting and control. And there is no more key subjects. Their duties are distributed between various governmental authorities as well as advisory bodies. Therefore, there are five key subjects, as we see on the slide. The general coordination is ensured by the coordination headquarters on humanitarian and social matters uh, under the Presidential Office of Ukraine, which is responsible for international aid and coordinates the operation of other subjects.
На слайді. Це
Which are listed on the slide. This includes National Coordination Stab at the Cabinet of Ministry of Ukraine, the Ministry of the Reintegration, the Ministry of the Social Policy, the Ministry of Economy, the President of Ukraine, the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of Internal Affairs, etc., the Ministry of Healthcare, Regional Military Administration, the regional state administrations, which during the martial law were renamed into the military administrations, as well as the Ministry of Youth and Sport. So what was the result? Absolute majority of these processes implemented at the level of the coordination headquarters and ministers in order to collect the data and analyze the needs, search for donors and satisfy the humanitarian aid needs of the beneficiaries are not related to each other, and they act in parallel. Each entity acts within the limits of its competence, or as the National Corruption Prevention Agency describes it, everyone is doing everything they can. Meanwhile, distribution of powers is not always clear. Cooperation between regional administration and non-governmental organizations and volunteers group is often poorly coordinated. There are direct, unregulated by the state bodies humanitarian flows between foreign and Ukrainian self-government governance bodies, communities, non-governmental organizations, and businesses. Therefore, humanitarian aid system existing currently in Ukraine is complex, poorly controlled, and not transparent. And therefore, it is a perfect environment for abuse, mostly of corruption nature. It should be noted that Ukrainian legislators provided for potential humanitarian aid abuse, and therefore, on March 24th, 2022, the amendments were introduced to the Criminal Code of Ukraine to provide the liability for illegal use of humanitarian aid. According to this law, now, these amendments relate the following. During the martial law, illegal use of humanitarian aid is punished with the prison sentences ranging from 5 to 7 years in prison.
окрім цього, потрібно зазначити і інші закони, що стосуються
In addition to that, we must note other laws which consider anti-corruption principles. So first of all, this is the law of Ukraine on prevention of corruption, which provided for the creation of National Anti-Corruption Bureau and the National Agency on the issues of anti-corruption issues. So in June of 2022, there was a anti-corruption strategy for the years 2021-25. And also some articles of the Criminal Code of Ukraine established the liability for corruption deeds. So Ukraine was quite ready for corruption deeds during martial law. But let's see how it is being implemented in reality. We must say that our previous research shows and identified factors that increase the risk of corruption in humanitarian aid sphere. Such factors, I think, all are typical of the present-day Ukraine. This is war, high level of pre-crisis corruption, weak anti-corruption measures, weak rule of law, high value of humanitarian aid, low level of transparency and accountability, low level of media coverage. Let's see. I'm going to prove that it really exists in Ukraine. So concerning the high level of pre-war corruption, if to use the index of corruption control, this corruption perception index, then we need to note that you can see it on the picture that in 2021 it was 32 points against 67 points in the United States. I should say that 0, this is when corruption practically substitutes the government, and 100 when corruption is practically absent in the life of the country. We must note that Ukraine is in the upgoing trend, and you can see that the United States are actually in the best situation during the last years. We can also use another index to prove. This is the index of control of corruption. It is measured under the scale of minus 2.5 up to 2.5. And in Ukraine, we have the 0.87, while in the United States, it is 1.07. So we see that the trend in Ukraine is rising, and in United States, it is going down. Concerning the low level of transparency and accountability, then in the context of availability of information, let me give you the quote of the Agency of Great Britain. There are multiple government-run information platforms. Ukraine is a very digitalized country, and these do not necessarily feed into information that the international system is gathering. What does it mean? Ukraine really is a very digitalized country, and the portal of humanitarian aid developed in Ukraine deserves special attention. It was developed by the Office of the President of Ukraine and the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine, namely an interactive map of humanitarian aid as of a certain date. This map you can see is presented both in English and Ukrainian languages, but it was a very good intention, but we can see that the website hasn't been updated since September 27. all the inflows were really marked here of humanitarian aids and cargoes, those which were brought by railway and by highways for different communities. They showed beneficiaries, organizations. It was a really good intention, but for some reasons, it is not been updated. In addition to that, operational data is available and is being updated on the websites which are supported by the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. It is here that they publish the data for the operation of partners of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. This is how every day such data looks like. It is one of the pages of the website, and the numbers presented by me on the first slide were taken from here. So we have all the backgrounds for corruption. But if we go on with our research, we must specify the understanding of corruption in terms of humanitarian aid provision. Here I will take the definition given by Transparency International, which says that corruption is abuse of the power in personal benefit. It includes such things as extortion, kickbacks, bribery, fraud, and also non-financial forms of corruption, such as manipulation or redirection of humanitarian aid to non-targeted groups, allocation of resources for sexual services, preferential treatment for helping or hiring family members or friends. And the last one is coercing and intimidating of employees or beneficiaries to turn a blind eye to or participate in corruption. In the current Ukrainian context, officials have possibilities to use their power and authority to get personal gain, especially the governmental officials, non-governmental public organizational officials, and volunteer groups that are the main actors in the humanitarian chain. So we have the question, what shall we do? We must control corruption risks. What does it mean to control corruption risks? This means coordinated actions which are aimed to control and prevent corruption risks. I must say that any basic process of control of risks has at least 3 stages. The first one is risk identification, the second risk assessment, and the third risk mitigation. What shall we start with? The first step should be understanding of the reasons, loopholes, and stimulus which feed corruption at any level. Or the first step in any strategy of prevention should be better assessment of possibilities for corruption. Or there are no instruments which exist now and which can really give ready assessment of corruption risks. For current day assessment of the risks, the most important is the information received from unprocessed state reports or reports of the agencies which provide aid, which provide also information on the number of corruption deeds. So these systems might assess corruption risks, which of them appear more often and under which context or circumstances. So these are the quotes taken from the reliable sources.
Отже, далі я намагалася
Uh,
створити саме
Here, I was
інформаційну
going to create a database using the following sources. News feeds on the websites of law enforcement and anti-corruption agencies of Ukraine, analytical reports, media, and social networks.
По-перше, використовується мапування
Why do we need to use corruption risk mapping? Because the reliable assessment depend on the data we collect, and the systems must assess the corruption risks which appear more often and in under which context and in which circumstances. Corruption risk method is actually a visual method of demonstration of complex issues connected with corruption in humanitarian aid, but in simplified and systematized form. And corruption risk map is aimed to inform the donors and state regulators on certain risks at all stages of provision of humanitarian aid in Ukraine. In literature on risk management, there are such types of maps. Map of identification, assessment, and control of risks. So this is actually a table or register of risks. The heat map of risks or matrix of risks, and the polar risk map, which is a radar diagram. We are going to improve these maps and to apply them. So, based on the corruption practices informed by the indicated sources in the period starting from the 24th of February till the 1st of December, I managed to identify 125 risks. Then I actually created their allocation according to several stages in humanitarian process. There are 7 stages here. There are risks of forming actors in the humanitarian chain, fundraising and funding risks, risks of delivering of humanitarian aid, risks of cooperation with local partners, procurement and logistics risks, implementation and distribution risks, and accounting and auditing risks. Let's look at the risk map in details. So the first thing which I'm going to show is actually the register. So without no description, these are risks without description of beneficiaries of humanitarian aid and other actors. So risks of formation of the actors in the humanitarian chain. This is registration or use of fictitious donors. This is providing receiving certificates for the input of humanitarian aid under the influence of interested parties. Conspiracy of actors in the humanitarian chain. Extortion of unlawful benefits from charitable organizations, and granting illegal permits to travel outside Ukraine for the transport of humanitarian aid under the influence of interested parties and including entering into the information database. Let's look at them in more detail.
Events were recorded and how our risk map actually looks like. So, let's take a look at the creation of bogus NGO recipients. What are consequences? Loss of state budget due to evasion of taxes and duties during customs clearance of cargoes. Another, declared beneficiaries do not receive humanitarian aid due to its potential sale. Hence, public trust in the CSO sector is undermined. And so who receives undue benefit in this case? These are organizers of the scheme who receive kickback payments, facilitation payments. So in this case, here's an example of risk events. The National Police reports two residents of Zhytomyr, a charitable organization was officially registered with the name of a resident of Zhytomyr region, and two residents of Zhytomyr region, using the documents of the foundation under the disguise of humanitarian aid for the armed forces of Ukraine, imported cars to Ukraine under the preferential procedure with zero customs clearance rate. Later, these vehicles were sold at market price. Law enforcement detained one of the offenders during the sale of another batch of these cars. In total, they sold over 20 cars, worth about 3 million hryvnias each. On the next slide, we see the illustration of another risk. This is this is related to the informational system, the way. So which is the key consequence? It's delay in development of humanitarian chains and delay in humanitarian aid supply. And who receives the due benefit? State officials may receive bribes. And what's the registered risk events we have observed? The General Prosecutor Office reports that the head one of the regional district military administrations in Kiev region and his advisor arranged a scheme for extorting illegal benefit from representative of charitable organizations for entering the driver data to the informational database. The offenders were detained after receipt of 350,000 hryvnias. Here it should be noted that this beautiful idea as creation the way informational database for border crossing during the martial law has created the basis for two types of corruption risks. This was the first risk, and now the second, granting illegal permits to travel outside Ukraine for transport of humanitarian aid under the influence of interested parties. The first risk event relates to this. So the General Prosecutor Office reports that an official of Chernovtsi Regional Military Administration entered information to the base system about permits to leave the countries by men of conscript age. Over 50 cases of illegal border crossing by men were registered using the excuse of humanitarian aid deliveries. Another risk and registered event relates to the influence of interested parties on the decision making related to the formation of humanitarian chain. As the National Corruption Prevention Agency reports, based on the report by the Ukrainian Member of Parliament Zadorozhny, Suma Regional Military Administration grant permission for citizen Kobzar in order to allegedly transport vehicles and humanitarian aid for the armed forces and the affected population of Sumy region. However, Mr. Kobzar, upon returning to Ukraine, declared the foreign vehicle as the one purchased for his own needs. Therefore, in this case, we see that the undue benefit is received by elite circles. Elite circles receive political capitals, and fictitious humanitarian actors receive financial benefit through exemption from customs duties. Let's go next. The second stage and the second group of risks are the risk of fundraising and funding risks for humanitarian aid. Here we have certain risks false in documents about humanitarian needs, overestimation of needs, misappropriation or misuse of the funds. And what risk? Now let's take a look at the risk events recorded by our law enforcement agencies. The first relates to the false information and documents about humanitarian needs. So the State Bureau of Investigations exposed the former acting state secretary of the Ministry of Economy, the former management of the state enterprise Ukrpatent, as well as the head of a charitable organization who misappropriated 250 million hryvnias. The head of the state enterprise had a balance of funds on the account, which he could spend exclusively for statutory needs. However, he decided to take possession of them. In order to misappropriate this fund, a charitable organization was involved. Its director provided knowingly false information and documents about the need to purchase bulletproof vests for the armed forces. The transferred money was withdrawn as a cash using a number of bogus company and misappropriated by the participants of the transaction. The second risk at this stage relates to the misappropriation or improper use of funds. Here we have the following case recorded. The office of the state, the General Prosecutor Office reports that an official of one of the city councils in Kiev region colluded with unidentified persons to make a profit at the expense of charitable donations. In February-May 2002, this person posted an announcement on the social media about fundraising for the needs of the volunteer group, of the volunteer formation of a territorial community. The announcements included the bank card details to which the citizen transferred funds. During this period, the offender received over 1 million hryvnias. The former official disposed of this money at her own discretion. The next group relates to the risk, to the fundraising and funding risk for humanitarian aid. Oh, sorry, wrong slide. Forwards. So the next group of risks are the risks of delivering humanitarian aid. Here we can distinguish two. We have to stress two important points. Humanitarian aid supplies to non-government control areas and aid supplies to government-controlled areas. The experience of small-scale war limited to this part of Ukraine shows that these two risks are different in their nature, and in Ukraine we already have the experience of aid supplies to non-government controlled areas. Currently, this risk has not been yet documented by law enforcement authority, other than forging the documents for crossing the line of control. As for aid supplies to government-controlled areas, here the mechanism of recognizing goods as humanitarian is used in order to evade taxes and fees during customs clearance of goods. This is actually the amendments of the Ukrainian. It was actually caused by this mentioned amendments to the Ukrainian humanitarian aid laws. Now, on the next slide, let's take a look at the risks. Actually, before 2022, let's take a look what risks events took place before 2022 to illustrate this risk of restricting the physical access to the people in need. It's a bribing of Ukrainian government, military and armed groups at the control checkpoints, which was usually considered as a small price for gaining access to the non-government controlled territory. as the researchers, as the United Kingdom researchers report. What's the problem with this risk and why it is so important? Actually, the most important of it, are its consequences. In addition to fail timely deliver aid, and the refusal of humanitarian actors to continue cooperation, especially foreign humanitarian actors, and its violation of the humanitarian neutrality principle, and damage to the national reputation. These are the key consequences of this risk. I guess the reputational consequences may be as the worst. And of course, here's the recipients of undue benefit are the checkpoint officers and related officials who accepted bribes. As for mechanism for recognition of cargo as humanitarian, for example, the General Prosecutor Office reports the following case. A charitable organization in Lviv region organized import of new apparel and shoes into Ukraine as a humanitarian aid. The total weight of confiscated goods exceeded 7 tons of goods, and its value exceeded 11 million hryvnias. The fifth stage are procurement and logistics risks. 15 risks have been identified, and 15 events related to this risk were identified. So it's clear how. So now let me just provide a description of identified corruption practices. One local non-government organization spoke of corruption and criminality in the railway system, where some organizations are being made to pay for storage and transport fees. And in one case, a whole train car of cargo got stolen. The UK researchers report. Next group are the implementation distribution risks. And the largest number of events are classified, 125 are classified into this group. This is misappropriation of humanitarian aid, sale of humanitarian aid, diversion of resources away from service delivery for private gain, extortion for transferring humanitarian aid to beneficiaries or being forced to pay, and fraud by executing agents. Okay, so the first case, the bribes for transfer of humanitarian aids to the beneficiaries, recipients have been forced to pay. The General Prosecutor Office reports that the acting mayor in Lviv region extorted 100,000 hryvnias of the undue benefit from volunteer for transfer of bags received by the city council on behalf of one of the Finnish associations as a humanitarian aid. The official was arrested after receipt of the entire undue benefit amount. The second case, diversion of resources for personal profit. The Security Service of Ukraine uncovered the deputy head of Chernivtsi regional administration on his duties included the distribution of humanitarian aid and ambulance vehicles received by Ukraine from Italy. He managed to enter agreement involving the chief executive officer of a medical facility. The hospital manager registered 5 cars on the civil charitable organization, public charitable organization, founded and managed by him, and started to use the vehicles to provide fee-based transportation services to the patient. Based on preliminary information, the deputy head of the regional military administration caused damages to the government estimated as over 90,000 hryvnias.
Sale of humanitarian aid. The Office of General Prosecutor reports that a resident of Dnipro received a cargo of humanitarian aid food imported to Ukraine from Poland. For Ukrainians suffered from Russian aggression. In the future, he decided to sell part of the humanitarian aid. And to do this, he found an entrepreneur who agreed to buy 38,000 units of tinned meat at a price twice as low as the market price. The man was detained while receiving 1,350,000 hryvnias for selling humanitarian aid. And the last example I will give, just to make it a bit shorter, my presentation. The Security Service of Ukraine and Anti-Corruption Bureau investigate possible misappropriation of humanitarian aid by top officials in Zaporizhia region. NABU agent Yevgen Shevchenko released information about the scale of the theft. Top officials are suspected of stealing 22 containers, 389 railway cars, 220 trucks from humanitarian aid in 6 months. There is investigation under Criminal Code of Ukraine. And the last group of risks are risks of accounting and auditing. These are risks which appear not so soon as the rest of them, and so we don't have a big number here. That's why we are going to proceed. The second map I want to show is the polar map of risks under the stages of humanitarian process. This is practically map in the polar system of coordinates, and I think it better suits the presentation, and it is not the basis for decision making. As we can see, the number of risks only, the types of them, like the risks of realization, risk of formation of humanitarian chain, risks of funding, or this map for all identified risks also identifies certain risks. You can see here the most evident from them: the supply of aid to territories which are not under control, the provision of illegal permits, and sale of humanitarian aid. And the third type is the heat map of risks under the stages of humanitarian process. Here I show only the simplest variant of this map. This is a 5-point scale. And how can we read this map? So, sorry, Pani Laryso, but we have only 10 minutes left for discussion. Could you reach the conclusions, please? Actually, to conclude, I would just say the words of gratitude to the world community for supporting Ukraine. And on my last slide, you can see the news from the Chernivtsi media for the first month, how every day we were receiving humanitarian aid to Ukraine. And one of the latest piece of news, this is that in Ukraine, under the support of American international organization, we are building modular houses. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much, Ms. Larysa, for such informative report. Sorry again for interrupting you. I think your report will really cause a lot of discussion, and I ask everyone to write your questions in the chat. Or Ms. Anna, please. Hello, everyone. I'm very grateful for such important and really informative presentation and report. I have several questions. First of all, what are mathematical methods you used during processing of all this data collected? And the second, do you cooperate or maybe plan to cooperate with the national agency, anti-corruption agency? And the third one, what do you think can be improved in the system of humanitarian aid in Ukraine?
Так, вимикаю я камеру.
Yeah, I will switch off my camera, sorry.
З того, що я зрозуміла.
So from your questions concerning National Anti-Corruption Agency, anti-corruption program for the years of 21-25 was adopted in 2022 in June, and it does not have any questions or issues related to humanitarian aid. And I would like to communicate with them concerning this point, because I think that currently humanitarian aid is very burning issue. And after our victory, we will be renovating the country, and this humanitarian aid will be implemented for different purpose for development. And it's obvious that we will also have very large scale of funding and very low and quite long-term projects. And obviously for corruption, this will be a good ground. That's why it must be reviewed together with the Anti-Corruption Bureau. Mathematical methods, for example, together with the researchers from Indiana University, we tried to the third stage, to implement the third stage in risk control. This is mitigation of risks. It means to lower them through implementation of direct measures. One of the measures identified in literature is control. And we asked ourselves, how can we mitigate the risks at the stage of implementation? At the riskiest stage, the stage of realization and distribution of humanitarian aid. And we asked ourselves, we need to assess the influence of intensified control on this stage. But there is another question. How many people should be employed as controllers? How often should they implement these control measures to actually have these funds realized, implemented to intended purpose? So we use these mathematical theories. We thought that if we increase the number of controllers, and if we increase it to the maximum, then we will have the best benefit. So did I answer all your questions? Yes, Miss Larysa, thank you very much. Could you stop showing the slides? Yeah, maybe colleagues will see each other better. Miss Maria, please, and then we have Miss Tatiana and Mr. Maxim. Thank you very much for such important topic raised. But I have a question, and my question concerns accountability and transparency of the humanitarian aid which we receive. Who gets this consolidated information? Who receives it? And the second question, not only Chernivtsi Oblast, where the head of the military administration resigned, not Zaporizhia, but Chernihiv. And during the first part of the year, government actually demonstrated a lot of non-transparent decisions and ways of distribution of humanitarian aid. So my question is, is it possible, being a digitalized country, highly developed digitalized country, as you said, report on a daily basis about the receipts we have in terms of humanitarian aid, is intended purposes, beneficiaries, and who is responsible for distribution of this aid? We understand that customs is actually those doors where the corruption processes are growing and being implemented. So all the heads of the customs were fired several times, and maybe they must be giving, they are giving actually way through to the transport. So did you come through the issue of customs when doing your research, and how we can actually check this accountability of our government? Is it possible to have this daily accountability?
Дякую за запитання. Ну, з приводу
Okay, thank you for your question. As for customs office, we see that the second most common risks are the risk related to the humanitarian aid delivery through the customs. The second risk is the digitalization. Digitalization contributed to greater transparency in humanitarian aid supplies and distribution. However,
виникає питання, я не знаю, до кого його
we have a question, and I don't know exactly whom we should ask it. Why? Why is the because we see in the website, we see in the interactive map, why the government ceased to update it in September? Why this project was closed in September?
залишаються, всі наші запитання залишаються відкриті.
So all our questions are still open. However,
Очевидно, це
and it's obvious. It obviously can be solved, and it should be solved. And our Western partners, they push us to solve this matter. However, we see what's going on. That's why I believe that we need to raise awareness about and create and discuss these cases and push the government to make decisions in this regard. Thanks a lot, Ms. Tetiano, and then Mr. Maxim and Mr. Evgen. Please, colleagues. I'll try to be brief. Therefore, it's rather not a question. It's not a question, but rather a suggestion. Let's call it suggestion question. Dear Ms. Larysa, you mentioned that one of the sources for your research were social media. I wanted to ask you what data exactly you took from the social media. But we don't have enough time, therefore I would like to just actually you have a very important research, and I would like to emphasize that this research may only win if you use the resources of civil initiative, of Safe FOP civil movement, the civil initiative. This is a movement of small business owners who perfectly know many corruption risks like from inside, and they may help to raise awareness about many corruption schemes. They also have some developed mechanisms and tools to solve to eliminate many corruption schemes, and this is especially important since we expect in reconstruction of Ukraine and large cash inflows, and these entrepreneurs, they have already started to criticize some suggestions offered by our top officials. Therefore, I think that your official could be even more powerful if you actually use this resource. These people are willing to help, and they have a lot of actual materials, which could be really helpful. Thanks a lot.
Дякую, пані.
Thanks a lot, Ms.
І
Tetiana.
зараз прошу, пане Максиме, я думаю,
And
що ми
now,
ще можемо
Mr. Maxim.
продовжити на кілька хвилин наше обговорення.
I think we can use few more minutes for our discussion because the topic is very important. Hello, thank you. My name is Maxim Yablonsky from Lutsk University, and I also have a suggestion from your research. I understand that humanitarian shipments, they are free or exempt of taxes. Do you think, how do you think? Maybe it would be better to actually make them taxable, however, to reduce these taxes only to the for defense budget. Well, you know that there are some discussions and consideration about the topic about removing this condition, about removing this zero customs clearance rate. It was introduced during the most acute stage of the full-scale invasion, which was unexpected for our government. And during this acute crisis period, the government implemented huge amount of laws that that affected the customs procedures of all humanitarian cargoes, and of course the offenders use it. And when the government realized what's going on, they currently discuss the option to cancel this condition. And in order to redirect these taxes to the armed forces, well, we know we always have good intentions, but we face a lot of trouble at the stage of legal implementation. Thank you. And the question from Mr. again, thank you for your report, how the humanitarian aid is distributed between the region of Ukraine. Is it true to say that the most affected regions, districts and cities have received the most humanitarian aid? Does the humanitarian aid distribution problem affect the level of corruption? Thank you. Yes, it does. And the quantities of humanitarian aid supplied to various regions of Ukraine are currently impossible to estimate. We don't have this data yet. Still, at the Ministry of Social Policy of Ukraine collects data about the needs. The Ministry of Reintegration also collects information about the needs, and then this information is provided to the donors, and donors allocate humanitarian aid. But how is it implemented? The final financial cash flows and humanitarian good flows, they are not transparent. We cannot see them. They are not in the open access. Thanks a lot, Ms. Larysa. And another question from Ms. Larysa Kisluk. Thank you for very valuable, much needed research. In your opinion, what is the root cause of corruption abuse? Is it the imperfection of the national legal system, or the problem of moral quality, or the moral qualities of our governmental officials? Is it prohibited to first of all, I think this is related to the moral qualities of our officials and other decision makers. And as for prohibition to occupy certain positions by the people with poor reputation, well, this is a perception of corruption among our population. We don't have zero tolerance towards corruption, like, for example, in the Western countries or in the United States. Thanks a lot, Ms. Larysa, for this wonderful report. We are very grateful for such interesting research and for sharing. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing your skills, your knowledge. And now I think we can go. We can start the next presentation. And I'm honored to represent our next reporter. This is Mr. Mykola Humaniuk, the candidate of sociological science, assistant professor at the Geography and Ecology Department of Kherson State University. Mr. Mykola has scientific interests include demography, social geography, the policy of memories, and today Mr. Mikola will discuss geography of special military operation and space production in the occupied territories of Ukraine. Please, Mr. Mikola. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Let me first